In this series on resurrection, one of the things we're doing is we are bringing a piece of evidence each week. A piece of evidence that resurrection not only can happen, but has happened and will happen in the future. We have talked about, anyone can discount evidence if you just don't believe in the God of the Bible at all, and you don't believe that something like resurrection could happen. But the evidence is still important. And so I'd invite you, especially if you're the kind of person who maybe feels like resurrection, somebody coming back to life from the dead, that could just never happen. If you feel like that, I would ask you to open your mind to some of the evidence and really consider it. So our evidence today, I'll get to it in a minute. This is a quote from D.L. Moody, who's a famous Christian leader. And this is his quote as he was dying. And you may have known someone who, as they were dying, experienced remarkable things. Here's his quote. "Is this dying? Why, this is bliss. Earth is receding, heaven is opening, God is calling. I'm out of here. I must go." There's a reason in the New Testament when Christians die, when their physical bodies die, it is usually not referred to as death. We'll see that some today. It is usually referred to as falling asleep. Jesus said, "Anyone who believes in me will in fact not die." Will our bodies die? Yes, they will. But we will in fact not die. Was this death? The evidence that we're going to look at today, let me just go here. The evidence we're going to look at today is this: near-death experiences. And we're going to look at it because I actually think, and many, many Christian leaders are feeling this same way, I think. I think that near-death experiences are very important today because many people today, which is different than in the past, many people today have a feeling that when they die, there's just going to be nothing. That's just going to be the end. Even if they don't think that that's true, they feel like that's true. Even many Christians feel like that's true. And so we need something. This was not the case in the past. I think in the past, in pretty much every culture throughout history, the general feeling, my guess, is that the general feeling was, of course, you continue to exist after you die. But today, because of many reasons, that's no longer how we feel. And so we need some evidence, some knowledge to counteract this deep feeling that we have. I put the word near in parentheses here, near-death experiences or just death experiences, because many of these experiences, the people are not just near death, but they are physically dead in every way that we can measure. Many of them, the people are near death as well. So these experiences are in two categories here. I'm going to recommend a couple of books for you. This is a recent book, the last couple of years, written by Lee Strobel. How many people know who that is? He wrote The Case for Christ. He's now written The Case for Heaven. It is not all about near-death experiences, but one entire chapter of this book is about near-death experiences. There has been a lot of research into near-death experience, even just in the past 10 years. Here's another book I'm going to recommend for you. Oh, we lost it there. This is Imagine Heaven by John Burke. And this book, John Burke is actually a pastor who, before he was a pastor, way before he was even a Christian, he came to faith in Christ through a near-death experience of his own. And this, John Burke is actually who, if you know Lee Strobel, he interviews people. And John Burke is actually who he interviews in the chapter on near-death experiences. Okay? So some of this, we've looked at a little bit of this before, but I'm just going to give you some quotes mostly from Strobel's book, Case for Heaven. And some of these quotations are again, he does interviews, so some of these are, this is John Burke, some of these and some of them are actually from Lee Strobel himself. So talking about near-death experiences, the whole subject is fascinating, I said. I think this is Lee Strobel speaking. I just read an article about research showing that 40% of patients who survived a cardiac arrest were aware during the time they were clinically dead and before their hearts were restarted. 40% of them 40% of people who clinically die as a result of cardiac arrest come back saying that they were aware of what was going on during the time that they were dead. Interesting. An increasing amount of research is being done. More than 900 articles have been published in scholarly journals on near-death experiences. That's a lot of research. Interesting. How much of this do I want to read? None of the alternative explanations make as much logical sense as the straightforward conclusion that there really is life after death. Okay, so he's saying the research that we find, the research that's been done, there are lots of people who think that the research doesn't mean that there is life after death. There's lots of debate about this, and there always will be. But he's saying the most logical conclusion is that there actually is life after death. Now, let's look at some of these instances. I'll give you a few here. And these, I highly recommend these books. I highly recommend you look into this more. These are just little snippets. We're only spending a few minutes on this, right? And this is a subject, we could talk about this for many hours. So here's some examples. Janice Holden studied 93 NDE patients, so that's near-death experience, who claimed to make multiple verifiable observations while out of their physical bodies. So there's a whole bunch of cases now that have been documented, right, where the person who was dead or near death actually says things that they saw that happened while they were dead, or they saw, in some cases, that they couldn't have known from the physical position of their dead body. And those things have been verified by others who were present. 92% of their observations were completely accurate. That's in this particular study that Janice Holden is doing. Think of that. Nearly everyone was totally correct about what happened while they were dead. Another 6% contained just some error, and 2% were completely erroneous. So 2% of these. So there's always a variation here. Some people come back from a near-death experience and say certain things happened that didn't happen at all. But that's only 2% of the people who were dead in this particular study. Now, some examples. There are thousands of these documented now. Here are some examples that are, let's just say, very interesting. A clinically dead woman able to describe exact medical procedures, able to retell a joke that a doctor told while she was dead, and say the color of the doctor's tie, even though she was never conscious while the doctor was present. She was clinically dead the entire time the doctor was present. Here's another one. A young woman who is almost dead. She has an out-of-body experience. She overhears her brother joking about her. Her brother is in another part of the hospital. Later, she embarrasses her brother by repeating the joke. What? A 5-year-old Dutch girl had an NDE experience while she was in a coma. While in this coma, she met a teenage girl, who introduced herself as her sister and guided her back to her body. She had never been told that she had an older sister by the exact same name that she reported after she came back. The older sister died before she was born. There are tons of these. These are just some examples of crazy things that had happened. Okay, let me back up. This is a clip, so it's going to need audio. Okay, this is a clip. We've seen this before if you've been here a while. This is Maria's blue shoe. So this was in Seattle about 30 years ago, University of Washington. There was actually someone who was researching near-death experiences, and so she was in the hospital doing research on near-death experiences. This woman named Maria dies clinically, and when she comes back, she tells people that she floated up out of her body, went outside the hospital, and could see a blue tennis shoe sitting on an outside ledge of the hospital 2 floors above her. She described the tennis shoe in detail. The researcher then went up and found it. It could not be seen from inside the building. Here's the clip.
It was all about peace. It was so peaceful.
Social worker Kimberly Clark-Sharp says she couldn't come to terms with her own out-of-body near-death experience until one of her own patients had one. The BBC reenacted it in this documentary. Clark's patient went into cardiac arrest. After she was resuscitated, the patient insisted that she had risen out of her body and floated up around the hospital, where she saw a blue tennis shoe on a third-floor ledge.
She got everything right, as she described it to me, and I didn't believe her.
But to calm down her agitated patient, she went to look.
I did finally, on the third floor, north end of the building, look down, and there was a blue tennis shoe on a ledge.
Dr. Morse says it's clear even when people are flatlining in the last moments of life, something profound is happening, something today's monitors can't pick up.
We first encountered that actually at Momentum. Sean McDowell showed that example to our youth at Momentum a number of years ago. Shout out for Momentum. Yeah. My point is, we're going on about this for a while, and I'll show you a few more as well. If there were just one of these instances, you might just write it off, okay? But people floating out of their bodies when they're clinically dead and they can come back with verifiable information they couldn't have known, what's happening? What's happening? Blind people. This one actually probably is the most powerful to me. There are 21 blind people in this particular study who reported NDEs. Blind and visually impaired descriptions of the experience show visual or visual-like perceptions, and some of these reports have been validated by outside witnesses. What we're talking about here is people who are blind, some of whom have always been blind since birth. And when they come back from a near-death experience, they can describe things that they've seen. That one in particular, the fact that happens is stunning to me. It's stunning. So, the point of all those is this. There is some very strong evidence that right after the moment you die, there's not just going to be a nothingness or a blackness or an emptiness, or I don't even know how you would describe the fact that you don't exist anymore. What's going to happen right after you die is that you are going to be fully aware of the world, and in fact aware of the world in a way that you've never been before. You are going to be awake and okay even though you're not in your body. You're going to be alive right after you die. And so here's my question to you. If you are the kind of person who feels like dead people coming back to life, that could never happen. If people are actually alive after your physical body dies, then why not? Why can't dead people come back to life? Why should any of you consider it incredible or unbelievable that God raises the dead? This is our key question, which Paul asks, of course, of Agrippa and the people that he's on trial in front of in Acts chapter 26. The thing about God is he brings the dead back to life. We're going in this series, we're looking at resurrection throughout the Bible. Here's what we've done already. We looked at the books of Moses, the Old Testament, what happens with resurrection, the idea of resurrection there. We looked through the Psalms. We looked at the prophets last week, which was very powerful. If you are the kind of person who ever wonders, why doesn't God just show up and prove that he's real? Go back and watch last week's message. Next week, we'll be talking about the future. Today, we're talking about resurrection, Jesus' resurrection, and resurrections that Jesus performed during his life. Here's our anchor image for this series, Paul before Agrippa. And this is the picture. So we're just remembering this so we can kind of see where we stand. Who is this? This is Paul. This is the Apostle Paul. At this point, he's a Christian. He's been traveling around the world for decades, preaching about Jesus, almost dying. People oppose him. Who's this? This is Agrippa. He's the king in this situation, although he's not actually the one in charge of this trial. The one in charge of this trial is Festus, Porcius Festus, who is the Roman governor. And we've said, in our image, we've said, okay, Paul is the Christian. He's trying to convince them. Why would any of you think it's unbelievable? It can't be believed that God is going to bring the dead back to life. It's perfectly reasonable to believe that he will do this. Festus, of course, thinks Paul is out of his mind. Agrippa, we saw last week, Agrippa believes in God. His problem has been that the world is in front of him. He grew up in Rome. He grew up with all money, wealth. He grew up with people of power, people who don't believe all around him. Have you ever felt like that? People who don't believe all around you. And you start to feel like, that's crazy for me to actually believe what the Bible says, or that God could bring the dead back to life, because nobody around me believes that. That was Agrippa's situation, but he also had seen clear evidence. And Paul is calling him back to look at the evidence. Remember, Agrippa, what you've seen in your own life. And in fact, Agrippa was around, or at least we don't know exactly where he was during the time of Jesus or right after, but he certainly was around in the area and knew about things that were happening. And what we're going to see Paul talk about today is that the things that happened in Jesus' lifetime and after, just after, those things didn't happen in a corner. They were public events that everybody knew about. They were what's on the news, if we want to think of it in today's terms. These were not myths that were made up by a small group of people hiding in a building, in a basement somewhere, and then circulated slowly. These were things that everybody knew had happened and everybody was talking about. So we see Paul say that here, right? We talked about this last week. Festus interrupts Paul's defense. You're out of your mind, Paul. Your great learning has driven you insane. That's one of my favorite lines in the whole Bible. I am not insane, most excellent Festus. Good sir, I have not lost my mind. What I'm saying is actually true and reasonable. You should think about it. The king is familiar with these things, and I can speak freely to him. I am convinced that none of this has escaped his notice. What he's saying is, Agrippa, I know that you've heard about all of this. It's not like this is the first time you're hearing that Jesus came back to life from the dead, because none of this was done in a corner. These were public events that have happened during your lifetime. Remember them. King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know you do. So none of this happened in a corner. We're going to look at just a few instances of resurrection here, connected to Jesus and happening with him. And here's the first one, John chapter 11. What happens in John chapter 11? Anybody shout it out for me? Jesus brings Lazarus back to life from the dead. So this is a friend of Jesus, this guy named Lazarus. And if you read the story, we're not going to read through the entire chapter. But what's happened just before this, of course, is Jesus was far away from where Lazarus was. Lazarus got sick. And then his sisters sent messengers to Jesus, because Jesus, it's well known that Jesus can just basically heal anybody who's sick. So they send messengers to Jesus. They say, come down. And what does Jesus do? Anybody? He waits days longer. He hears that his friend is sick and dying, and so he says, okay, let's not go. You call 911, and 911 says, okay, we'll be there in 4 days. Wait a minute. So the disciples can't understand. They can't understand why Jesus doesn't rush down there. Jesus has a plan. This is part he is now going to do. He's bringing out, we've talked about it before like this, he's bringing out the big guns. He is bringing out things, pieces of evidence which will stand for the rest of history as a testament to the fact that God brings the dead back to life. He's going to bring someone back to life from the dead. He's already brought people back to life from the dead. Already. But before this in his ministry, he's always done it super secret. Right? You remember there was like a synagogue administrator whose daughter had died, Jairus, and everybody knows they're actually having the funeral. Jesus shows up at the funeral, kicks everybody out, brings the dead girl back to life, tells the parents to feed her, go give her some lunch, and then he says, when you get outside, out of the funeral where your daughter was just dead, what I want you to do is tell everybody you were wrong. She wasn't dead. She was just asleep. Because he doesn't want, at that point, he doesn't want everybody to know that he is the Messiah. He is the resurrection. But now he's going to do a resurrection from the dead that is undeniable to all the contemporaries around him. And you're going to see that nobody denies it. Okay, so This is, he meets with Martha, and this is a powerful statement Jesus makes to her. So now Lazarus has been dead for 4 days. Jesus finally shows up. How does she feel? How do you feel when the ambulance finally gets there 4 days after your brother dies? Yeah, you're probably going to sue the government, right? She's ready to sue Jesus. I don't know. She actually has a pretty good attitude, all things considered. She says, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Why didn't you come? But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. Whoa! She has faith enough to believe he might be able to do this. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. She thinks he means at the end of time. I know he'll rise again in the resurrection at the last day. I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even if they die. So at this point, of course, Jesus very famously, most of you will know the story. If not, go read John chapter 11. He goes out. He makes a big scene of this. There are hundreds of people who follow him. There's a huge crowd there when he stands in front of Lazarus' tomb. He has people roll this stone back, and he yells at a guy who's been dead for 4 days. And the guy stands up and walks out of the tomb. What would it have been like for you if you were there? The thing about Jesus' miracles is there's no like CGI graphics that happen when Jesus does a miracle, right? There's no smoke. There's no big bangs and amazing, like he's some wizard or something. He just calls out to Lazarus, come out. And then Lazarus comes out and then he's alive. And then nobody knows what to do. Some people are ready to worship Jesus on the spot, right? Some people are ready to say, okay, if you can do that, we think you can probably beat the Roman army. I'm going to go with, yeah. If they kill us all, you're just going to bring us all back to life and we'll keep fighting. Okay, but that's not his plan, of course. He's not going to fight a war. It's not who Jesus is. Some people go away from this and they say, so we're not going to be able to stop Jesus from having followers. That's not going to be a thing we can do anymore. So let's kill him. I don't know why. I've said this before. I don't know why you would come up with a plan to kill someone who can raise someone from the dead after 4 days. That seems like just this. You're really caught up. That seems like the dumbest thing you could ever do. You should be scared to do that. So he does this public miracle. No one can deny it, not even his enemies. And that's the debate, actually, among his enemies. People who think, well, he's still teaching the wrong thing. We don't like what he's teaching. We think he's wrong. So we got to stop him in some way. This is the debate among them, is now we can't. Now we can't discredit him. There's no way. He's done a public raising of someone from the dead after 4 days in front of hundreds of people. And what do you think all those people did as soon as they got back to town? What would you do? They told everybody that they knew what they had just seen. I mean, you tell people about way less interesting things than this all the time, right? The resurrection of Jesus himself. It's more evidence that resurrection is actually possible. This piece from John chapter 20 is the story of what happens on that morning. Of course, there was a guard on the tomb. We'll talk about that in just a minute. Early on the first day of the week, that's a Sunday. That's why we worship on Sundays now. While it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. She goes to the tomb to somehow minister to Jesus' body, finish up things that had not been done to it. So when she saw that the stone was not there, she came running back to Simon Peter and the other disciple, that's John himself. He never writes his own name in his gospel. So she comes running back to Peter and John, and she says, they've taken the Lord out of the tomb. Somehow his body is gone. We don't know where they put him. This is another piece of evidence in several ways. Number one, notice the disciples don't expect him to rise from the dead. Even though he's raised Lazarus from the dead, even though they've seen him raise another girl from the dead, even though he said he would come back, the disciples themselves still felt like, he can't, resurrection, that's just not a thing that happens, is it? Can we really believe that he would come back to life from the dead? Only his body's not there and they don't know what's happening. Peter and the other disciples start for the tomb. They're both running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. Hilarious in John's own gospel. He probably wrote this after Peter died, and he still has to put in a little thing about how he beat Peter in the foot race to the tomb. Like, do you see it? Why else would you write that in there? Yeah, and I beat him, yeah. I mean, he was 15 years older than me, but still, I took him out. I smoked him. He bent over and looked in at the strips of linen lying there. The linens that they had wrapped Jesus in were still in the tomb. They were lying there, but John didn't go in. He was kind of scared to go in. It seemed like a holy place. It was a holy place. He didn't see a body in there. Peter goes in behind him. Peter goes straight into the tomb. He's the kind of guy who didn't see any boundaries and just crashed through things. That's kind of Peter's life. He saw strips of linen lying there, as well as cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head. They examine what's there. His body is gone. Everything that he was wrapped in is there. The cloth was still lying in its place, separate from the linen. The other disciple finally goes in the tomb. That's John. He believes. John's the first to believe. Jesus is back. He did it. He defeated death. This is later in that same chapter, on the evening of that first day, that night, when the disciples were together in a house with the doors locked because they're terrified that the government is going to show up and arrest them or attack them. Jesus came and stood among them. He just shows up. Notice they don't even know how to describe how he gets there. They don't say there was smoke and mirrors, or there was a light show, there were CGI graphics, and then suddenly Jesus materialized in front of us. No, just he wasn't there, and then he was there. And they didn't even know how he showed up. And he's there in his body. Peace be with you, he says. After he said this, he showed them his hands and his side. That is where the actual wounds were, from the nails and from the spear that had pierced him. He was really dead. The disciples were overjoyed when they saw the Lord. That's got to be the understatement of the book of John. They were overjoyed. Everything has changed. Carrying on a little bit about his resurrection, this is Matthew 27. This is Pilate talking with the Jews. Of course, right? Jesus has at this point been crucified. And they buried him in the tomb. They put a huge stone in front of it. But they want to make really sure, right, that there's no way anybody can steal his body, right? And so they put a guard on the tomb. Go make the tomb as secure as you know how. This is Pilate, the governor of the province, saying to his officials, his army, his soldiers, his Praetorian guard, go make sure that the tomb is as secure as you can make it. So they went, made the tomb secure by putting a seal on the stone, and they posted a guard on the tomb. Then, of course, in the next chapter, we see this. There was a violent earthquake. This is the next morning, Sunday morning. An angel of the Lord came down from heaven and, going to the tomb, rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothes were as white as snow. The guards flee, of course, at the sight of this angel. The women go back and so the women were on their way. While the women were on their way, some of the guards went into the city and reported to the chief priests everything that had happened. All of this, what I'm showing you, is that none of this was done in a corner, right? This is Paul's argument to Agrippa. You know about all this stuff. Agrippa knows. Agrippa's part of the inner circle of the elites in the Roman Empire and in the eastern half in Judea. Agrippa very likely knows that this was made up. Agrippa knows that when the guards came back, they reported that there was a blinding flash of light and some sort of being made of light that threw the stone back from in front of the tomb and then sat on top of it. And they were so terrified of him, they thought they were going to die. These hardened Praetorian guards ran for their lives. Agrippa knows that that's what they reported when they got back to town. This is what Paul is saying. I know that Agrippa, this wasn't done in a corner. This is public stuff that happened. You know, Agrippa, you know what happened. Why would you think that God can't raise the dead? When the chief priests had met with the elders and devised a plan, they gave the soldiers a large sum of money, telling them, "You are to say the disciples came during the night and stole him away while we were still asleep." Another extremely foolish move. I mean, if you ever know about an actual being of immense light that is like lightning and can throw stones out of the way, don't lie about that being. That seems like a foolish thing to do. And then they, of course, tell the guards they won't get in trouble. You're not going to have to commit suicide over this. Of course, Jesus shows up alive after this as well. There's a number. We could go through passage after passage about this, but we'll go through just a few. Actually, before we even read this one, what are some of the instances you know of where Jesus showed up alive? Just shout it out to me from the crowd. Who saw him? What are some of the stories that the Bible reports on this? People on the road to Emmaus, 2 disciples who thought that everything was done now because Jesus had died. This is a day or two after he died. And as they're walking along the road, Jesus in his body shows up and gives them a whole lecture on why they should believe the Bible more. What else? Who else? Very famously, Thomas, right? Thomas saw Jesus. Thomas wasn't that earlier in John 20 where we read that section and all the disciples were together. It wasn't quite all of them, was it? It was all of them except for Thomas. And Thomas told them, "There's no way. You guys," he was like Festus almost. He was like, "You guys are out of your minds if you're trying to tell me that Jesus, who I saw dead, is alive again and just appeared suddenly in the middle of our house. There's no way I'm ever going to believe that." And Jesus shows up in front of him in his body, and he says, "Here you go. Go ahead and stick your hand into the hole that's still in my side." Somehow the hole is still there. And of course, Thomas doesn't do that, maybe because that's kind of gross, or maybe because he just realizes there's my Lord and my God. He falls down before Jesus and worships him in that moment. What else? The women saw Jesus a number of times. Jesus showed up while Peter and his buddies went back to fishing, right? And Jesus shows up at their workplace. Imagine Jesus shows up in his body at your job. "Hey, can I give you a hand? You're not doing a very good job. You want some help?" This is 1 Corinthians 15. This will be the last scripture for today. And this is, in many ways, we'll be looking at this further in the chapter next week as we talk about what's going to happen in the future. But just to show, once again, evidence that this was not done in a corner. These were public events. Here's Paul's argument for why we should believe that the resurrection actually happened. Here's what he says to the Corinthian church and to us today. "Now, brothers and sisters, I want to remind you of the gospel, the good news, the message that I preached to you. You received it, and you've taken your stand on it. But I want to remind you what it is. By this gospel you will be saved if you hold firmly to the word I've preached to you, but otherwise you believed in vain." You got to remember this. So like Paul was telling Agrippa, you really know Agrippa. What he's saying to us today, Community of Hope Church, we really know. It's not even just that we believe that Jesus rose from the dead. We have evidence that is overwhelming. We could say that we actually know it's true that Jesus came back to life from the dead. And therefore, us coming back to life in the future, there's no reason we can't believe in that. That's no problem for God. We got to hold firm to that. And then he begins to recite it, to bring it back to their minds. What I received, what he heard, who did he hear it from? Who did Paul receive this gospel from? Jesus himself appeared to Paul. Paul was going 100 miles an hour in the opposite direction, persecuting Christians, and all of a sudden a being of immense light appears to him and blinds him. And he says, "Who in the world are you?" And the being says, out of the sky to Paul, "I am Jesus. That's who I am. Why do you keep persecuting me?" Stop it, Paul. That's who he received it from. And this is the most important thing, that Christ died for our sins, according to the Scriptures. That he was, in fact, buried, and that on the third day, he was raised. He came back to life, according to the Scriptures. And that he appeared to Cephas, that's Peter, and then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. What was that, Paul? At some point in those 40 days after Jesus was crucified, after Easter, Jesus appeared to a gathering. He appeared in his body to a gathering of the church, of his disciples, of more than 500 people. And what Paul is saying, this was a public event. Now, Jesus didn't appear to the thousands of crowds in Jerusalem in his body, no, but he appeared to a group of more than 500 people. Stop for a minute and think what a room full of 500 people looks like. Would 500 people fit in this room? Not unless we were all standing and crammed in here. A group of more than 500 people at the same time saw him. And here's Paul's point. Most of them are still alive. So he's saying at this time to the Corinthian church, you guys know this. And in fact, many of you have met people who saw him physically in his body. Jesus coming back to life from the dead, it's not a myth. It's not some religious fairy tale. It's a historical event that was public. It was not done in a corner. And then, of course, Paul says what I mentioned earlier, though some have fallen asleep. Some of those 500, at the point Paul is writing, some of those 500 who saw Jesus, what had happened to them? What would we usually call this? They had died. Paul is unwilling, especially in this context, to describe what has happened to those people as death. Do you think those people who saw Jesus back alive after he had died, later on when they were dying, do you think they thought that was the end and nothing would happen after they died? They would just cease to exist. Those people knew. They knew what D.L. Moody knew. Is this death? This is bliss. The earth is receding away. Heaven is open to me. I must go and be with God. This was not done in a corner. There's good evidence to believe that Jesus rose from the dead. There's good evidence to believe that when you die, you will not cease to exist. You will be alive and just fine in this present world, and one day your body will come back to life from the dead. Do you believe it? Let's pray.